Hey y'all, and welcome to the next module in the Practical Packet Analysis course. And in this module, we're talking all about command line analysis tools. So thus far, we focused mostly on Wireshark, which is a really great tool that uses a graphical user interface to allow you to investigate packets. But we're going to switch gears a little bit and talk about command line tools because they certainly have their place in the investigative process. And certainly, if you do this job long enough, you'll eventually run into a scenario where you're forced to use a command line tool, either because that's the only thing you have available or because it's really suited to the particular task at hand. So I'm going to talk about a few of those use cases, and then we'll talk about things like TCP dump and tshark and also cap tipper. So why use the command line in the first place? Why even include this module when we have great robust tools like Wireshark that are graphically based and a little bit easier to use? Well, there's a lot of reasons to use it, but a lot of the common reasons I hear not to use the command line are things like it's much harder, it lacks the feature set, it's just not as good as the graphical version. And all those are legitimate complaints, and most of them are true. The command line is generally a little bit harder. It's more difficult to remember the commands you have to use, the specific syntax, and some people just generally aren't as comfortable on the command line. However, there are a few reasons where the command line makes sense, and I'm going to go through those quickly here before we get into the tools that we're going to be digging through. First, the command line abstracts you less from the data. We've talked about this a few times when we talked about protocol dissectors. And anytime you're dissecting data and representing it to a user outside of its raw form, there's some degree of abstraction. Graphical tools tend to have more abstraction, whereas command line tools have less because they don't have as many options for extracting the data. As in, when you're displaying text-based data in a text-only way, you can only abstract so much. So generally speaking, you're less abstracted from the data, which means less assumptions are being made in regards to the analysis being conducted. Less assumptions usually often means better analysis or forces you to make your own assumptions. So sometimes we need those assumptions. Definitely, they're not they're very useful to us, but being mindful of where you're abstracted from the data and lessening that is sometimes useful in the analysis you're doing. Particularly, I see this a lot when you're performing analysis of custom or unknown protocols versus those that Wireshark might try to interpret and maybe interpret wrongly. Next is using the command line is much better suited for large files. And if you think about it, when you take something like Wireshark and open up a large capture file, you're essentially loading all that into your memory. And memory on a computer is a finite resource. There's not a lot available on many systems. And as a result, it may slow down your system. It may compete for memory with other applications, especially if you're like me and you often have one or two virtual machines running, taking up big chunks of memory. And then you're trying to load this big PCAP file, which is fighting for resources, and it can get ugly really fast. So something like Wireshark loading into memory is not always the best answer. Oftentimes you want to use a command line tool, which is going to do stream processing of the file. So it's going to process parts of the file as it gets to them and then release those from memory. So it's a little bit more efficient in that regard. Similarly, command line tools are often better suited for longer captures because, again, you're not saving everything into memory, and also you have the ability to automate those a little bit better, especially on a Linux operating system where you can use a cron job, for say, to schedule a specific task, have it output to a specific format, have a watchdog process that watches it and restarts it. That's generally the use case you're going to be using for really long captures, especially those of you who are doing network security monitoring and you have packet captures running 24/7 by 365. It's a lot easier to keep those up. That's not something you would nearly do with a graphical tool. You're almost always going to use a command line tool. It may not be TCP dump or tshark, which we're going to talk about here. It could be something like netsniff-ng or daemon logger or stenographer or something like that. But nonetheless, command line is generally better suited for these longer capture files. Another useful thing is that command line often produces more portable output. Think about if you have output from a specific packet capture and you want to do something with it. Let's say you want to do something as simple as counting the number of lines in the packet capture file, or maybe you want to export a specific column and send it to a spreadsheet or another processing application, maybe into some type of loop in a custom application, do maybe a DNS lookup. That's a common use case. If you do that in Wireshark, it's a lot of manual fiddling. You're actually physically exporting the file. You're probably opening it in Excel, tweaking it a lot, saving it out as a CSV file, so on and so forth. On the command line, this is actually quite simple. It's a simple matter of piping output. And if you're familiar with Unix and Linux and how you pipe data from one output to another on the command line, it's very straightforward. It's simply as easy as entering the pipe command and entering the new command you want to port your data to. So you can pipe things to grep for searching or cut for specifying specific columns, and then pipe again to a specific script you have, maybe that DNS lookup script I mentioned. Maybe you just want a count of the packets that applied to a specific filter. So you can run tcpdump, list the filter, and pipe that to wc-l to count the number of packets. The output is incredibly portable, which is the beauty of really any command line tool, is taking the output from one process and sending it to another process. And of course, we have all those great Linux command line tools like sed and grep and awk and cut and so on that are very useful to get familiar with if you're doing things at the packet level. Finally, the only other reason to use the command line that really stands out to me is that sometimes it's all you have. Sometimes you may have to do packet analysis on a system that does not have a graphical user interface. A Linux system, maybe a server, maybe a Windows server core system that doesn't have a GUI. And if it's all you have, obviously you want to be familiar with these tools. Now, with that said, I'll tell you my most common use case for using the command line, which is something I think you might run into as well. And it's the ability to take really large packet capture files, filter them, and then open them in Wireshark. So I have the use case often where I need to capture a lot of packets from a single system, and it may be a busy system, right? It may be a server. So even an hour of packet capture may be gigs upon gigs of data. And if I have a 30 gig packet capture file, that's certainly not something I'm going to be able to open in Wireshark, probably even if I wanted to. So what I'll do is I'll capture the packets using a command line tool and store those to disk. From there, I'll use a command line tool like tshark or tcpdump to apply filters to that to do stream processing and break that up into smaller files. For instance, I may have a file for a specific conversation or a file for a specific host. I may create a file just for DNS traffic or just for HTTP traffic. I may filter based upon single conversations. The options are definitely limitless given the flexibility I have in filtering. What I'll do is I'll break those up into separate files, and then I'll open it up in Wireshark. Once I get it into a manageable file, then I'll turn to my GUI. So the command line tools in this case aren't really being used for analysis, so to speak. They're being used to format the data and get it down into manageable chunks. And that's a perfectly good workflow. So often we get posed a question, are you team command line or team GUI? And I'm really team both. These things work in concert. It's not this false dichotomy of you have to use one or you have to use the other. I constantly use tshark and tcpdump and Wireshark. I'm using all these things. And that's exactly why I wanted to include this command line section in this course. So let me tell you about the objectives of this module and what we're going to cover. We're really going to focus on two tools, tshark and tcpdump, which are by far the most common command line packet capture and analysis tools. If you've installed Wireshark, you already have tshark. It's already installed on your system, ready to go if you took the default install options. tcpdump is very popular, installed by default on a lot of Linux-based operating systems, and even if it's not, it's only a single command away from being installed. So these are the most common tools, and I'm going to discuss their practical use cases. So I'm not going to get extremely in-depth. I'm going to show you the commands I think you need to know to do 95 to 99% of the analysis and capture work that you'll be doing. I'll speak directly to my use case I mentioned of a large capture file, filtering that down and dividing that into other files. And I'll show you some unique features of both tools and what makes one maybe a better use case than the other. So each of these exist in their own sections. So you don't have to watch the tshark section and the tcpdump section. If you believe that you'll only be using one tool and you know which one it is, only watch that one. They're meant to exist independently. They don't have to be watched together. There's not a ton of references back and forth other than some simple compare and contrast. So I use both tools generally. I prefer tshark in most cases due to the number of protocol dissectors it has and the ability to use Wireshark display filters. But I also use tcpdump a lot too. As a matter of fact, on my Mac workstation, I generally rely on tcpdump for doing most of my basic filtering where Berkeley packet filters will suffice. So I do recommend learning both tools, getting familiar with both of them because they both have their strengths in different areas. But nonetheless, if you know which specific tool you want to learn more about, you can focus just on that video, and we'll get into that right now.